So my next series of videos, I'm going to be showing you how I built this 14.5-foot built-in. Obviously there's still upper cabinets to make, but this is basically the progress I have in the shop. First series of videos is going to be showing you how I make these base cabinets. As with a lot of my built-in projects, this starts with a drawing. I don't have plans for this because these are always very specific to a space, and the chances of someone having a space that matches this is going to be pretty slim. But with this series, I'm trying to go a little bit slower with this one so people can really see how I made it, and you'd be able to glean enough information to transfer this into your own dimensions. So for the base, I'm starting with 2x4s. Sometimes I make these out of 2x3s, but the baseboard that is in the room is only 3 inches, so I can get away with using 2x4s. I'm just ripping off the edges and making my pieces 3 inches tall. Basically, this base is going to go into the space. It's going to be leveled in the space, and then the front of it will be covered with the baseboard. So depending on what baseboard is in the room or what baseboard is going to be added is going to determine the thickness of the space. Like I said, the one I'm using is only 3 inches tall, so that is what I'm doing. This is going to be 2 sets of cabinets. The window is not centered in the room, so both sides are not symmetrical, which is why you'll see obviously one side's bigger than the other, but pretty simple. I just take the dimensions of my base, the width of the cabinets, and I'm going to make a base for them to sit on. I clamp these together, screw them together, pretty self-explanatory. Obviously you want this to be square. These 2x4s are not always going to be true, which is one of the reasons why I rip off both edges. It removes any sort of crown that's on there, but I also spend the time finding 2x4s that are pretty straight, don't have a lot of twisting or cupping, and I make sure I build this base pretty much the same day I buy these. These 2x4s you get in the store are not fully dried yet, so if you let them sit around for a long time, for certain purposes, some purposes I do let them sit around to dry, but for stuff like just the base that's going to be covered, that's holding up cabinets, I make sure to build it pretty quickly. So then for the top, all of this is going to be made, the bulk of this is going to be made out of 3/4 inch maple veneer ply. It's pretty much the standard I use in the shop. Basically just going to rip down my parts. These are some of the bigger cabinets I've not only ever made, but definitely the bigger cabinets I've made in a while. I can easily maneuver sheets of plywood around the shop, but you'll see just a smaller space. So as I start building these pieces, it gets a little bit difficult to maneuver everything. The angles of this are not going to be great just because it fits in the shop, but it's kind of off to the side. So I do apologize for the lack of great angles on some of these shots. So the base cabinets are quite big. The tabletops comes up to 30 inches, and the depth is also going to be 30 inches. The cabinets will have a overhang on the top, so they're going to be 24 inches tall. The whole thing will 24 inches deep. The whole thing is going to have a face frame, so the cabinets are going to be roughly 28 inches deep. So as you can see, all I'm doing is ripping down my pieces. I'm going to start with one of those dimensions, and then I could rip them, cut them down to size on the radial arm saw. That's pretty standard in this shop. Rip one dimension, whichever one you choose really, on the table saw, and then rip to the other dimension on the radial arm saw. You'll see you will get some tear out with this, using the radial arm saw. I really need to change out the blade, but the nice thing about built-ins, at least the ones I've made so far, they're all paint grade projects. So while you don't necessarily want to think about patching things, it is much easier to patch and fix mistakes in paint grade projects. So now this cabinet is going to have 2 pullouts between the surface of the tabletop and the cabinets. So as I'm building this, you'll notice there's going to be a pretty substantial gap at the top. I mirrored that gap on the bottom because these are also going to be very wide cabinets. So I wanted a thicker face frame so that my middle panel especially does not sag over time. So all I'm showing you is where I'm cutting the dados for all of my shelves, and then I'm going to put a 1/2 inch backer on this, so there's going to be a rabbet on the back. I like to do that with bigger cabinets, wider cabinets in general. It's not substantially more expensive to use 1/2 inch these days. 1/2 inch ply is almost the same cost as 1/4 inch, and especially since I transport all this stuff, it just makes sure everything stays more true over the course of this project and installing it with that thicker backer. So pretty simple. Like I said, I'm going to be putting all of my shelves, the upper shelves, bottom shelf, in dados. So I do a test cut, as you saw earlier. I ordered all of this plywood at once. And the first thing I do is I go and measure the thickness, because it's really easy to order this stuff, but it doesn't always come the same thickness. I've gotten orders before with 3 different sizes. Luckily, all this ply looked identical. It was all the same thickness. 3/4 inch ply is usually closer to 23/32 of an inch, so I could set my dado stack for that, make all my cuts, and make sure they all fit. So like I said, the top and the bottom are the same distance off, and then I could go through and do the middle panel. Now the drawers in here are going to be filing cabinet drawers, so I decided to do a full sheet of ply in the middle. Sometimes I do half a sheet, but these cabinets are going to be holding up a very substantial amount of weight. The drawer boxes are going to be on the precipice of too large for the hardware I'm using, so if anything, I'm overbuilding this. But pretty simple stuff. When you do the drawings and SketchUps, it's nice because you can just transfer all those measurements. You already spent all that time doing the drawing on there. Now I try to get these dados as centered as possible, but I knew they weren't going to be exact. So at this point, I sectioned off all of my pieces into pairs. You can see it was lined up when I had this facing one way, and when I flip it, it's off by about a 1/16 of an inch. So it's okay to build things that way. The customer's never going to notice a 1/16 of an inch, but just make sure that if you are not going to perfectly center things like this, to match off pairs that match. So at this point, I'm going to be putting the backer on, and I'm going to be doing it in a set of pairs in order for the backer to be on opposite ends. I'm making sure I'm sending one of the pairs through with the front side first, and then you'll see I can put it over in the corner, and then the other side I will flip and make sure that it's on the opposite side. I've definitely made the mistake of taking a stack with everything oriented the same way, running it through the dado stack, and then all of my dados were on the backhand right hand side. You have to make sure with your pairs you're putting one on the backhand left hand side and one on the backhand right hand side. I always mention that in my videos because it really sucks when you make that mistake, and I've definitely done it. So you can see this last panel, I flipped it bottom to top. Even though it looks symmetrical at this point, there is a top and a bottom at this point, and then that's how I did that. So then in order to get the width, at this point I'm drawing right off my bases. Another reason I don't like to put plans for large scale projects like this is it really depends on how you build things. If my base is a 1/16 of an inch off compared to the dimensions of the drawing, it's not going to matter for this project, but it will affect all the dimensions after that. So going forward, I kind of glance at the plans, but generally speaking, I take all of my measurements off of what I already built. So I could line those panels up on the frame, mark where the dados are, measure between those marks, and then cut all of my panels. Like I said, sometimes I decide not to do full sheets. This is going to get really heavy, but at this point, I do try and carry this stuff by myself. I usually make them in pieces so they're transportable that way. It's easier to get them in and out of my truck, in and out of someone's home as well. But at this point, I was resigned to the fact that I knew I was going to have to use a hand truck, which is a great tool for transporting stuff like this. So weight was not as much of an issue with this project. So then, like I said, same project. I'm taking a sheet of my material. I'm going to rip it down to my depth, and then I could take it over to the radial arm saw and cut it to my width. cutting widthwise on the table saw gets a little dangerous. I will do it, but I don't have a large outfeed table. I don't have a side outfeed table, so it's just a much safer cut to make on the radial arm saw. And you can see how these panels are so wide. They're not necessarily heavy. It's just juggling them around all of the stuff in my shop was a little bit of a hassle. Luckily, the upper cabinets are large, but they're only 12 inches deep, so it's going to be a much faster process moving all of these materials around. So like I said, I could cut all of my pieces, and when you see what I'm basically making right now is 3 sets of bottom cabinets. 2 of them are about the same size, 1 of them is smaller, and that design is just based on the fact, like I said, the window is not centered in the room. So then here's that first set of panels. I could test them in place and then start mocking up all of these. So this is this dado, even though I measured it, it's still a pretty tight fit, which you want a nice fit. Just tap it into place. You don't want to have to beat it into place, especially with the glue, and gluing everything together is already going to be a little bit of a hassle with the size of these cabinets. So right now you can see they're dry fit in place, and because of those dados, they're holding themselves together. So these are those 2 sets of cabinets. I'm going to have to move this one over because I want the foot of this to sit on my base, but other than that, they fit on there quite nicely. And then going forward right now, like I said, I'm no longer pulling from my plans. I'm going to put this piece in place. My 2 sets of sides, I'm going to square up on my base, measure in between, and that is going to be for this smaller set of cabinets. Now for stuff like this, you'll see when I do the face frame, it's going to overhang the sides, which will give me room to scribe this in the room. Basically, the room is about 4.5 feet wide. I make everything a little bit smaller. This is an easier build in the sense that there's a large void in the center because it's a desk. So I don't have to worry about fitting it necessarily in between 2 walls. If I have to scooch one of these base cabinets over ½ an inch or so, it's not going to affect it. So that is also nice when you have to squeeze these in between 2 walls and all the cabinets go wall to wall. You have to really be careful about how you lay out your measurements. You do not want to get it in this space and it doesn't fit, and that goes for not only width but height as well. All the walls and the ceiling in homes are not going to be square, so I usually give myself widthwise at least ½ an inch play, and top to bottom height-wise I do at least an inch. Most people want crown at the top, so it will hide that anyway, but that is something to think about if you want to build one of these. So with those base cabinets in place, the top is going to be 30 inches, and while I was ripping things down, I cut the 30-inch tops, just kind of put them out of the way for the time being. Making the top will obviously be in another video, and that's basically that. The reason I'm pushing these through so hard at the end is because I sometimes forget to open the door of the garage, and it's just shy of 8 feet from the blade of the saw to the door, so sometimes they hit that door a little bit, which is why the end of these cuts, you could see I'm kind of forcing them a little bit, but then they're getting done. And then after I cut the two tabletops, because it's going to be 2 sheets of plywood to make that span, I went through and ripped down the backers. Like I said, this is ½ inch ply. Pretty simple. I just measure the opening on the back. It's going to be essentially the same width as the shelves I just cut, so I remembered the dimension, and obviously it's going to be the same height. I usually do about 1/8 of an inch shy, just so that the backer isn't proud, and go forward from there. So then to put the face frame on, I do this a couple different ways. The way I decided to do it for this one is essentially with a tongue on the cabinets and then a groove on the face frame. This does take more time, but I like the way it fits in place. I like how structural it is. You can do this with pocket screws. Face frames with pocket screws are totally acceptable, but I've just gotten used to doing joinery on the cabinets in order to attach the face frames. basically take all the pieces apart before I glue them together. You could see I'm putting just a centered tongue on all of my pieces by having a dado stack in there, and then when I glue everything together, the entire front of the cabinet will have that tongue, and then I can put a groove on my face frame and attach them that way. So that is basically what I did before screwing these together. I wanted to use clamps for these because you will see the insides of these by the tabletop, but because they're so big, I was having an issue with bowing on right towards the center of these cabinets. I don't have enough large clamps in order to deal with that, so I ended up putting screws as all connectors between these. Where all this stuff meets the walls, you won't see it. I don't have to worry about it, but I will have to patch that inside screw holes. Honestly, I'd rather it turn out square than worry about screw hole patching, but that is something to consider if you will have sides you're built in that you will see. And then I can just put some chalk lines on the back and attach the backer. I usually don't permanently attach those in the shop just in case I have to make adjustments on site. It's easier if the backer is not attached, but before I install them, I permanently glue those on. And then I could start the face frame for these. So my face frames are going to be made out of poplar. I buy the pre-milled poplar from Lowe's. It's a little more expensive, but it means I don't have to mill it in the shop. I usually find that the milling is pretty decent, so I don't have a lot to do to it at all. I could bring it right into the shop, start ripping it down and attaching it. Now, like I said, the face frame for this one is going to be pretty thick. I did a very similar built-in, ironically enough, for a friend of this customer who recommended me to do this one, and they wanted really thin rails and stiles. And I remember with that project, it also had quite large drawers, and I wish I would have recommended doing thicker ones, because over the course of building this, you could visually see they were starting to sag, and I had to constantly make adjustments to the drawers. So this one, the stiles are pretty thick. They're 2 inches. I'm making them wider than my base by about 1/4 of an inch, as you can see. And that is so when I bring it into the space, I can scribe it so that it fits the wall perfectly. And then with that, accounting for that 1/4 of an inch, I can just put it up against the tongue, mark where that tongue's going to be. This is all a 1/4 inch tongue, so I have a 1/4 inch dado stack in my saw, and I can rip that groove and attach it right to the face frame. This is a press fit. Obviously it's going to be glued. I'll put some brads in there as well, but I like things that hold themselves together without mechanical fasteners. So you could see all I had to do was trim the where this was going to meet the tongue on my horizontals, and then it snaps into place. Now, I do permanently glue these stiles in place, which I usually don't do because I like to scribe them, which I can still do. It's just going to be a little bit more of a hassle with them glued in place. But I decided to do that for this project for 2 reasons. Number one, I want to make sure my drawer reveal is perfect, and if I remove the stile, it usually messes that up. Number two, because this is only about, with the base and the top, this is only about 26 inches of material that's going to be hitting the wall, and in my experiences in a space that short of a span hitting the wall usually doesn't need to be scribed. The wall's usually not bowed enough for that short of a span to matter. The upper cabinets will definitely have to be scribed because they're closer to 60 inches. So then I added the stile to the other side as well. For these 2 cabinets, same process. I just did a double groove. Those 2 cabinets come apart, so that one is not permanently glued into place. Like I said, I'm going to have to use a hand truck for all this, but I didn't want to get too crazy with making this too big. And then same process, all I'm doing is lining these up with the groove, marking where they should go. I can cut that groove on the table saw. The tops and the bottoms are all the same, so I could cut those all at once, take it over to the chop saw, cut it down to width, and put it in place. There's a little bit of play in these, which is nice. I could really dial in my 90-degree corners. All the drawers that are going to be in this cabinet are inset drawers, which is going to make life much easier if this face frame is square. So my stiles are 2 inches, all my rails are 1.5 inches. Next week's video is going to be doing all the drawers. There's multiple different types of hardware I'm using and a couple different style of drawers, so that will be another in-depth video. But this, like I said, was basically just building those bottom carcasses.